our industry, environmental insurance, and frankly, the environmental industry overall, there's a constant debate about going green. Is going green good? Are we getting, appropriate benefits out of our efforts for going green? And I'll tell you, to be honest, I don't know if I really want to solve that problem. I don't think this is the right forum for that. But it does bring up some questions. And I wanted to just, throw that out. This is our coffee talk, and throw that out for discussion today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great topic to talk about. There's obviously a lot of good things coming out of going green. But I don't think we should lose perspective about how we're impacting our environment by going green.
Right.
So I think it's a worthwhile topic to discuss today.
So I think maybe a good place to start is let's talk about where I think most of the efforts about going green have been focused. And it's mainly targeted towards carbon and mitigating carbon. Specifically, how do we mitigate the anthropogenic introduction of carbon? Carbon that's put into the atmosphere through human processes. Conversely to, natural processes, which would just be, perhaps like a forest fire.
Right.
Caused by lightning or volcanoes, again, maybe perhaps precipitating into, large-scale fires. But there has been, since the Industrial Revolution, a massive increase of carbon in the atmosphere. And all of that carbon has been taken out of storage. And that storage is in a couple different ways. You'll see storage of carbon in polar ice caps through just trapping of
Right.
air in polar ice caps, or you could see storage, frankly, through the geological process, and that's where most of the carbon is trapped, is through that geological process. And we can see this and monitor this through the geologic record. We've taken core samples and performed those studies. But what we have never seen in the past is the rapid increase of carbon in the environment through anthropogenic processes or causes. And that is where all of the focus for going green has really gained all the attention.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting is no one's talking about, the other ramifications of some of the instruments, the equipment, or some of the other things that go into going green. It could be waste created from the wind energy industry.
Mm-hmm.
Could be the solar panels after they've already achieved or been consumed, their usable life has been consumed. Not even to mention, and I'd love to get into this, considerations around sourcing the material that goes into the equipment that supports the green industry.
Yeah.
And the waste created. I'll kind of throw it out to you. What do you think?
Let's dive into how the process of extracting some of these green materials is going to impact the environment in the short term and long term, and what are we doing to acknowledge those? I think when you're talking about electric batteries, electric engines, those are some very rare and precious metals that are used to build those, and it's not an easy extraction process to get those out. Manganese, cobalt, you got to mine that stuff, and it can take, examples of mines I've seen, it's 55,000 gallons of diesel fuel a day, 1 million gallons of water. So we're dumping carbon back into the environment using
Right.
55,000 gallons of diesel a day, and where's that water coming from, and who are we taking it away from?
Right.
I think those are all implications that we need to look at as we are extracting those resources.
Yeah.
And then, as you mentioned, we can spin off later and talk about what are the long-term implications of having those precious metals
Right.
in disposal sites later on in the process when they're no longer being used.
So that's really interesting. When you're saying 55 gallons of diesel, that's 55 gallons of diesel per unit extracted, right? It's not just 55 gallons.
Yeah.
When you do the math and you realize, how much resource has to be consumed in order to extract the other resource that you're looking for to fuel this green industry, the numbers become staggering.
There you are.
I think you may have been alluding to the book by Siddharth Kara, the Cobalt Red book. There he talks about sourcing of material that goes in everybody's phones, as well as I think it was up to 60 kilograms of cobalt goes into each electric vehicle. So, you look at the supply chain of what is needed to create these materials that we are using and pushing and creating to abate carbon in the atmosphere.
Yep.
It almost begs the question, what are the other kind of knock-on effects that we might be creating from our effort to mitigate and abate carbon in the atmosphere?
That's just one metal, one extraction process. You've got to multiply that across multiple metals that are used,
Right.
and multiple locations across the U.S. and the world. And this isn't just a problem that's only in the U.S. It's happening in foreign countries that have, this mining going on. And they're not necessarily in the minds of Americans every day because they're sort of out of sight, out of mind. There are some serious negative implications that the mining will have in those countries and those regions as well. And I think we need to look at what those long-term implications are going to be to the environment, because we haven't really studied those, because this is all new technology. It's all new avenues that we're traveling down to try and fight off putting more carbon into the environment. And while I agree that we need to restrict the amount of carbon that goes into our environment, absolutely, we also need to have that balance about what are we doing on the other side of the equation, because we want things to be evened out as much as we can.
Yeah, definitely a more measured approach.
Yeah.
And making sure that everybody's informed as to what goes into generating that clean energy.
Yep.
A couple thoughts. With solar panels, for example, there are heavy metals that are in those solar panels. For example, cadmium. How do you manage that material when it becomes a waste? Do we have the resources readily available today? Or what steps are we taking to make sure that we're prepared to manage that waste appropriately? If we zero in, for example, just on the cadmium, how do we make sure that when we're performing our waste profiling to dispose of that panel at the facility that will receive it, that we're performing the adequate waste profiling testing? And if you're doing the T-clip test on maybe some crushed glass, all you're going to get is glass, totally inert. Whereas if you're testing the metal, then you're going to get the hit of cadmium.
Right.
It has to be treated as a haz waste versus going into non-haz. Now, why do we care? Because it comes down to cost, right? If you've got to dispose of something as a hazardous waste, the cost elevates significantly.
Yes, it does.
It's a 2 or a 3x factor versus a non-haz waste. So there are serious considerations for the waste generator to perhaps selectively sample certain things that might not be an adequate representation of what that waste is.
Right.
If that happens, then it goes into a non-haz waste facility, and perhaps it doesn't have the adequate lining to protect groundwater and soil and the introduction of those metals into our drinking water resources. It's an interesting feature of this green industry that has gotten less focus.
Yeah, and I think there's two other avenues we can go with that as well in talking about the disposal of solar panels. I mean, right now, California is the leading installer of residential solar panels. And the first generation or two of solar panels are now starting to die off, and they're going to start hitting the landfills in large amounts. As of today, California really only has a couple waste facilities that are licensed by the state environmental agency to accept the kinds of metals that you're talking about into those landfills. The vast majority of the solar panels are getting shipped out of state to neighboring states where they're being disposed. So we're also adding in more carbon to the process to truck those exposures out of state. So we're adding more carbon into the environment on the front end, and then spinning to the post process where it's actually hitting the landfills. And to your point, is it going to the correct landfill? And if it's not, then that landfill owner is now going to get cited for accepting material which they didn't know was hazardous and had these, metals in them, like cadmium, but they're accepting it, they've accepted it, and now they're getting cited by the state and federal environmental protection agencies. And from there, if it's not handled properly in that facility, is it seeping into the groundwater? Is it traveling to adjacent properties? What are the negative effects that's going to have on the local environment as well? There's so much to digest in this process. And I don't know that anybody is specifically addressing those at present. And I think we just need to look at that. And from an insurance standpoint, how do you think the carriers are going to respond to this as we move forward? Or what do you think they're doing now to address those questions?
That's a great point, because as we all know, on environmental policies, if there's an intentional noncompliance with a law or a regulation, that's going to be excluded. If there's an unintentional violation, if you make a mistake, you're a generator and you just didn't know that you're disposing of haz waste, there might be a little bit more grace in interpretation of that policy language. But how is that going to affect coverage? How are carriers going to view that? Have you gone through the right protocols and done your diligence to perform the right waste profile sampling to make sure that not only it's going to the right landfill or the right receptacle, but it's also not going to jeopardize maintenance of your insurance policy? To make sure that you've got coverage. And if there is an exposure that was fortuitous and unforeseen, you've got that protection.
Just projecting out a bit, if there are seepages and leaks of this hazardous material and it spreads, God forbid it hits groundwater and travels, the remediation costs, the lawsuits, it's going to potentially drive premiums through the roof for everybody, not just those individual businesses, but across the board. And so I'd be curious to see what the analytics are saying about, potential exposures down the road and how the carriers are looking to address those. And I know we've got models for, contaminants hitting groundwater and things of that nature, but this is an additional exposure that's now being added into the mix, which maybe we haven't quantified fully from an insurance perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we all know, insurance is somewhat of a lagging indicator. We're always being more reactive than we are proactive, and frankly, that's the point to having this conversation. And I want to make sure that everybody understands we're not taking a side. We're not saying that going green is good or bad. The point is, let's make sure that we're looking at this problem in its entirety, and we're making informed decisions on the best way to not only mitigate carbon in the atmosphere, but also to make sure that we're not causing some kind of collateral damage from our efforts to pursue this green initiative.
And I think if you look at traditional oil and gas as an example, after 100 years of oil and gas, we have a pretty good idea of what carbon does to the environment and the carbon coming from oil and gas usage. And we're understanding what those impacts are. My hope is we don't take 100 years to figure out what the environmental impacts are from going green. Right. I hope we can get that process started quicker and understand it, because there are going to be some negative side effects. But I think the sooner we can understand what those side effects are, we can remediate and abate those side effects, right? And deal with those in a hopefully a more efficient way than we have with oil and gas traditionally over the years.
Yeah, so I'll bring up a great example there. It was an unforeseen consequence. We were looking at ways to make fuel burn cleaner, in particular gasoline. And what we decided to do is add these fuel oxygenates, and there were a variety of fuel oxygenates. Most people know MTBE. That was something that was added to fuel to make it burn cleaner and to help, clean up the air. Again, going back to my days as an environmental consultant, what we saw is this additive then caused a different consequence. It was very miscible in water. It dissolved readily in water. And once it hit water, it would migrate very quickly. And it caused, unfortunately, significant contamination to groundwater. So in our effort to pursue cleaner air, what we did is we actually contaminated our groundwater. Now, as an environmental consultant, somebody who got paid to go out and clean up groundwater, that gave me a job.
Right.
That was another unintended consequence that benefited my industry in particular. But the vast number of communities that would have contamination to their groundwater, it was a very damaging unintended consequence by the petroleum industry to try and do something that would have been for the greater good. Similar correlation to what we've got now with this green industry.
Building on the idea of what the impact of the green energy process are having on the environment, but let's get into a bit more about what the impacts are to the insurance market
Sure.
in general. And we talked about the solar industry and in its impacts, the solar panels, having to be transported out of state. I know there's some potential transportation pollution liabilities issues there if it, a truck upsets and overturns with that type of stuff. What are some other insurance implications that you're seeing at present with the green energy movement?
Boy, it's a multi-layered question. So let me see if I can try and answer that maybe all the way at the beginning in the underwriting stage, and then maybe perhaps on the end with some of the exposures and perhaps the attitude that claims folks might take towards it. There's been a lot of talk about net energy metering, and it goes by the acronym NEM. So California has a program called net energy metering, and it's a way for them to offer some subsidies to the consumers or purchasers of solar panels, in particular residential solar panels. Mm-hmm. What they do is they'll give there's a slight subsidy towards how much money that homeowner might earn from selling their energy back to the grid.
Right.
With NEM 3.0 that got pushed through and passed in April of 2023, they cut that significantly. And what that has done is it's doused flames on the demand for solar panels in California. And what's interesting with this industry is wherever California goes, the rest of the country kind of follows. Or maybe another way to say it is California, many times leads the way with these green initiatives. Yep. And then the rest of the country will see that and then adopt it in their own way, whatever makes sense in their own jurisdiction. One of the repercussions that came from that is there was a loss of roughly 15,000 jobs, specifically in the green energy space and solar in California. So we have seen a significant reduction in demand for solar panels installed on people's roofs. And that has led to a reduction in revenues for solar contractors installing the panels. So a couple things going on. You're seeing reduction in exposure base. As your exposure base goes down, your pricing is going to go down as well. So we're seeing a reduction in premiums for these, not from a rate standpoint, but an overall exposure base standpoint. What we see both in our bonding facility, and I see it on a brokerage basis as well, is these premiums are starting to reduce, whereas the previous couple of years we were seeing exponential increases in revenues. We were seeing a likewise obviously increase in total premium, although rates were compressing. Now the expectation for rate has already been compressed. Now a reduction in exposure base, you have carriers that are not taking in as much premium. We all know that claims come in after, of course, you've got a latent effect or a latent receipt of a claim. So if you're not taking in enough premium to cover those claims, or rather if you're not taking in enough money to cover historic liabilities, then you're going to have a crunch when it comes to your book. We're also seeing a reduction in the number of carriers that are playing in that space. So I think maybe the reduction in supply of limit from fewer carriers chasing those accounts might have kind of been in lockstep a little bit with the reduction in revenue, so it hasn't been as much of a disruption. But we are seeing a reduction in premiums chasing or carriers chasing that premium. So I think that's one repercussion we're seeing in that space. There's been a waning interest by carriers in the solar industry. Let's look at the environmental exposures. What are these solar contractors doing? They're installing panels on your roof. essentially this is a very specialized roofing contractor.
Right.
Perhaps they're not putting shingles on your roof. They're putting a large metal and glass panel on your roof. And they're going to have to fix that equipment to your roof with some kind of fastener, screws, brackets, what have you, and they're going to have to damage the integrity of the roof. What that does is it creates a pathway for water to enter the building envelope. And as we all know, you need three things for mold to occur. You need mold spores. Those are ubiquitous. You and I are touching them right now. It's everywhere in our environment. You cannot avoid it. They need a food source. The food source is anything that's organic. And the things that are organic in your house, wood, paper. That's a lot of what the construction of your home is. So you've already got two of the Holy Trinity for creating mold growth, right? The third is you need water. When you fasten these panels and you damage the integrity of the roof, you're creating a pathway for water to enter the building envelope. And now you've got the Holy Trinity of mold growth. You've got a food source, you've got mold spores, and you've got the water. So that's your main exposure with this. When you're looking at the waste stream that's created, of course you're going to have maybe some different lubricants or maybe a solvent or cleaning liquid that you're going to use for the panels. But I would say the main exposure with the solar is going to be from a non-owned disposal site angle. And it's going to be disposing of these panels that have some metals built into them. What's interesting is to try and evaluate where that exposure or who might own that exposure. For example, whenever there's a release at a landfill, you're going to have the landfill that's responsible because they were negligent in making sure that their landfill had the proper integrity to hold the material and not allow any material to escape. However, you're also going to have liability if you are that waste generator. Now let's look at it from an industrial or commercial standpoint. If I'm a chemical, manufacturer, if I do something or use a chemical or create a product that has some hazardous components, and I use something and I dispose of it, I am the waste generator. Under RCRA, which is federal code, I am responsible as a waste generator for that waste, and there's strict liability that ties me directly to that waste even after I've disposed of it. As a company, as a corporate entity, hopefully I'm still in business, I can generate enough revenue to cover that issue that I've created through creating waste. And I can address that if and when the federal or state EPA comes back to me and seeks compensation for my contribution to the landfill pollution condition. I ask you, what happens when a homeowner is responsible for generating that waste? Are they going to be ready to receive a notice from the federal EPA that their portion of contribution to a pollution condition at a landfill is, $23,000?
That's a tough pill to swallow if you're a homeowner and all of a sudden you're getting tied into that liability process, right? That liability string. Could they argue that, well, it's the manufacturer, really? I was just using it. I didn't really build it.
I mean, you and I both know these manufacturers are mainly based overseas. So, our laws may not capture a foreign domiciled manufacturer. Perhaps there is, some kind of a caveat that allows homeowners to be exempt. So let's pull that thread. What if you are an investor and you are an LLC or a company that owns a number of single-family residential properties? I'll tell you, in my town, we have had people knocking on the doors, door to door, and these are investment companies seeking to buy homes. I don't think you can fully remove yourself from that liability. I'm very curious to see how that happens, how that plays out.
Let's play that out going down that scenario. They remove single-family home exposures from that string of liability, whether it's a company or investment company that owns it or individuals. Who ultimately is going to pay for it then? The taxpayer, potentially.
Of course.
Right? Because the government's going to have to pay for the remediation and abatement at some point. That's coming out of our pockets as well.
Correct. That's a very good point. I mean, frankly, that's what the Superfund amendment to CERCLA is an amendment to create a large fund that we all contribute to address abandoned properties or properties that are blighted or have contamination that have been abandoned by the historic property owner that was the responsible party for the contamination. Yep. So when you see a landfill that receives a Superfund designation or gets put on the national priority list, you will see them try and defray the cost to clean that up by roping in the generators of the waste. It'll be quite interesting to see how this plays out. Will they be able to pull in, a homeowner as a generator, or an investment company as a generator? What are the legal costs that are going to be associated with that? And at the end of the day, someone's still got to clean it up.
So I was just thinking of a scenario that's sort of relevant in my historic space, talking about soccer. So I know there's a complex in Southern California that was, it's like 20 some odd soccer fields, and it's built on top of a landfill. What if that landfill had cadmium and some of these other metals in it? Are we going to allow development to go on top of those type of landfills? And if so, what are the implications for that? Because if they're using groundwater that's being contaminated by the cadmium and they're pumping that back into the grass and kids are coming into contact with it, what are those issues going to be down the road? And so, it's just, it can go in so many different directions, the implications. And obviously we haven't addressed them all yet. So be curious to see how we do that going forward.
Right. Pull that thread. What if you've got some fertilizers that you're using to, treat the grass or help the, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides to treat the grass in the soccer field? What happens if that starts to percolate into that former landfill? Lots of different ways you can look at that.
All right, Canaan. So we've talked about some hypotheticals. We've talked about potential issues, current issues that are going on. How do we bring this home for our retail agents, our insureds out there? How do we get them feeling better about some of the potential risks? Because this isn't a scare tactic that we're trying to do. We're just openly discussing sort of some of the negative implications of going green, against the many great things about going green. How do we bring that home to our retail agents and their clients, their insureds?
You have to make sure that your coverage is structured properly. You buy the appropriate product. For example, if you're a contractor, you buy, a CPL versus a property owner, you're buying a site pollution or a PLL. And then you have to work with a broker that's knowledgeable in the industry to make sure that you're right sizing with the correct product. So I think to sum it up, you need to work with somebody that understands the industry.
Yeah, and I mean, we have the expertise in-house in Jencap to provide those types of solutions to the insureds and the retail agents that are out there. So keep us in mind. We can get the job done for you guys.